Hey, hello. Welcome everyone to this roundtable featuring author Antonia Malchik. Maybe you have heard of her book, A Walking Life, Reclaiming Our Health and Our Freedom One Step at a Time. I read this book this past autumn, so I've spent a lot of time with your writing this season, gratefully so, Antonia. So bio for Antonia, I would like to share that Antonia has written essays and articles for Aeon, Orion, High Country News, and a variety of other publications. Her first book, A Walking Life, about the past and future of walking's role in our shared humanity, is published by Hachette. She is originally from Montana and currently lives in her hometown, where she writes, edits, walks, excuse me, and works on local pedestrian advocacy issues. Well, I love your lifestyle. And I want to say thank you, welcome. And I will also be co-hosting this roundtable with Darren, who is based in Madison, Wisconsin. And we will be welcoming Antonia to read a passage from her fascinating book, very unique book on walking, and then also turning it over to all participants. We have a really nice group of participants here for a Q&A. So I will turn it over to Darren. If you would like to introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, hi, Darren Wisniewski, based out of Madison, Wisconsin, and just an advocate for design cities for all people and all abilities. So love this topic and a huge fan of this work.
Thank you. Welcome, Antonia. If you would like to say anything or dive right into a passage share. We've never started a roundtable with a reading, so I think personally it would be lovely.
I tried to choose something that's not too long because I've really pared back on readings because my mom used to take me to a lot of readings when I was a teenager and I found them really boring. But when you go through like a writing program, you're encouraged to read and sometimes read for like 20 minutes or longer. And I have found after publishing the book in particular that I really like dialogue. I like hearing what people are thinking, what they're questioning, and talking. So I try to keep my readings really short. But before I did that, I just wanted to say, before we recorded, we were chatting about clearing the difficulty of getting people to clear sidewalks of snow. And in response to that, there's just a whole bunch of examples from different places in different communities that you're all in. And I just want to say thank you for that, because it's really cool. It's what this is about, right? The Walkability Correspondents Network and working on these solutions and finding ideas. So like I can take these to my bike and pedestrian committee that I'm on in town and try to start making some movement on that. Okay, so I chose two short-ish selections. I timed it. I think it's like 5 or 6 minutes. Hopefully not more than that. The first selection is from the end of a chapter called Stumble, which is mostly about how we lost walking in North America, the introduction of jaywalking laws, how roads and streets used to be public spaces and over time got taken over by cars and the car industry's interests in general. So this is from towards the end. And right after the first paragraph, there's a bit in there about walking with my dad in the Soviet Union, which I lived in for a short time when I was 14, which is where he's originally from. In America, cars are associated with freedom. You get in your 4-door or your convertible or your truck, and the world is open to you. That's what the car commercials show and what our national imagination tells us. A teenager's first set of car keys is handed over with a trunk load of independence. The world is yours now, kid. This is what defines your freedom. Not the ability to vote or drink or live apart from your parents, the ability to drive. And with the ability to drive comes the ability to escape our neighbors, our communities, and our fellow human beings. After my family left Montana in 1991 and settled into Moscow, we took the train to Leningrad to spend time with my father's mother and siblings and to meet my cousin for the first time. There, my father took my younger sister and me on long walks and told us stories of his childhood. His pre-Montana life began to take shape for me, not just in my imagination, but physically. The particular cucumber-like smell in the stairwell of my grandmother's apartment building, the bridges my father had illegally jumped from to go swimming in the Nieva River, the route to his school, which he'd hated, and to the zoo, where he'd go by himself to feed the elephants. And woven through all of it were the walks he'd taken later with his friends when they explored the city on foot and the territories of forbidden thought in their conversations. Many years later, long after Leningrad had become St. Petersburg and the Soviet Union had collapsed, when I was living my ex-urban life where I couldn't cross the road from the bookstore to the grocery store without a car, I thought back to my father's walks. Even growing up under Stalin, assuming they avoided being shot or sent to the Gulag, and later after Stalin died and the Gulag was dismantled, but free expression still came with severe consequences. People like my father were free to roam, the mind encouraged in movement by the feet. But my children and I didn't have that particular freedom. Like so many Americans, living where sidewalks do not exist, but busy roads abound. Every errand or outing was predetermined for us, its route mapped and enforced by what was accessible to my station wagon. We cannot stray, meander, or wander, and I couldn't help but wonder if our form of movement was beginning to constrain our flexibility of minds. This was really the promise dangled in front of us throughout the car-centric century, which was made possible by jaywalking laws and the eviction of pedestrians from the public roads, and initially sold almost exclusively to white America. Owning a car and living in the suburbs made life orderly. Not only could you have the perfectly cut dandelion-free lawn and wide roads for your traffic-free drive to work, but you could avoid the painful mess of living among people whose culture and struggles you didn't understand and whose place in society you questioned. You could get in your sedan and drive away from it all to a world where the difficult questions of justice and equity and reparation and mutual interdependence didn't exist, or at least you could pretend they didn't. But as human beings have had to learn over and over, there is no a way. You can't just send all your convicts to Australia and have petty crime disappear. You can't throw out your plastic packaging and not see it turn up in the food chain. And you can't gate yourself off from people whose race or religion or gender or culture you're not comfortable with and expect that your community, your family, or yourself will always remain exactly as you wish. We will never have all the roads we need for everyone to drive everywhere they want in the free, lighthearted way promised by car manufacturers' advertisements. We will never have all the highways and exits and bypasses, all the country roads and garages and parking lots. The city of Futurama is, like all utopias, something that will never come to pass. The question is, even if that utopia were within our grasp, given the gifts that walking has granted us and how much it still has to offer us in our communities, would we embrace that future? Or do we want something more, a more expansive kind of freedom, a built environment and a way of life that can nurture us at every layer of our human selves? I did have a second section, but I can stop there.
Maybe towards the end, we can close out with a reading as well. I
Yeah.
like it. I enjoy it. Darren, do you have a question or two? I was thinking Darren and I might have some specific questions having read your book, and then we can, since we have such a great group gathered here, move into the Q&A after a couple of questions from both of us.
Yeah, number one, I just want to share, I read the book after you did an interview with Jeff Wood from Talking Headways podcast, and that's what kind of piqued my interest. And the timing turned out to be incredible for me because I think that was 2019. And then when COVID hit in March of 2020, I live in a smaller house. It's 1,000 square feet. There are 5 of us. I have 3 kids and my wife. So now we find ourselves all home. But one of the things that I remembered was the importance of walking to calm you down, to build up just your creative energy and just to relax. And so we instituted just a required 30 minutes twice a day of walking that everybody had to go out. You could walk as a group, you could walk individually, however, but everybody now had to get out walking. And so I think that saved my marriage and my family, just being able to do that. I attribute it all to being able to walk, just to get out of the house. But in reading the book, there's just so much information. And I guess my question is just, what just prompted you to put all this information down. I understand that, you had some connections to walking. You just shared, some recollections from or insight into your father's growing up in Moscow. But yeah, I mean, what was there something particular that just prompted you, said, I just need to get this out there?
Yeah, it was actually a small collection of, I don't know, call them circumstances or coincidences, but part of it, my father, this whole thing about how my father was free to walk growing up in Leningrad, played into it at some point early on. But initially what triggered it was my son, my first baby, was born very premature, like close to 8 weeks premature, and he was in neonatal intensive care for a month. And it was a pretty difficult start to life for him. And he qualified for a program called early intervention, which is I kind of forgotten at this point how it's structured, like by states in the US and then by county. And through that, he was getting speech therapy, and then they gave him physical therapy. And the physical therapist would come over and just walk with him. And we were living in upstate New York at the time, and we had we didn't have a yard. We just had this field. It was very messy. Our neighbors hated it a lot. It's full of cattails and swamp grasses, and it was bumpy. And the physical therapist would go on about it. Like, she loved taking him for walks in this field. It wasn't big. It's not a big space, but he was, barely 2 years old. So it doesn't matter. And I was like, why does this matter so much? Like, I love it because we've got the red-winged blackbirds, and we have monarch butterflies that come and hatch there. And I loved all the nature stuff, but she talked about the uneven ground and how important that was for his brain development. And so being kind of at the time I was still a travel writer, but my undergraduate degree is in mathematics. So I've always had a lot of interest in science. Sorry. Excuse me. I think I'm getting over a bit of a cold. So I was just curious. I was like, oh, I didn't know that, and started looking into it. And I ran across things like how difficult it has been to build a bipedal walking robot, because there's so many calculations that go on in the human brain every time we take a step. And I just thought, this is really fascinating. And then I kind of, threw that together with not actually being able to walk anywhere, whereas my father, growing up in the Soviet Union, could walk for hours and hours. And so this kind of muddle of, wow, this is really huge for our brain development, combined with, wow, we don't have the freedom to do this because we're so dependent on cars and car directed infrastructure. And I originally wrote an essay for a little literary magazine called Lunch Ticket that kind of had those ideas in it. And then I wrote another one for Aeon called The End of Walking. And that's kind of where this book came from. All of those ideas from those essays are in the book, but it really came out of that Aeon essay. Just, we've lost the right to walk in America. How did that happen? How can we get it back? So that's okay. And actually, after that essay, I thought it was done. I was like, I've said everything, about walking that I need to. And then I just kept, I would listen to the Overhead Wire and, Jeff, and come across all these ideas. And I was like, well, maybe there's a little bit more. So that's how the book came about.
Great. Thank you. Annika, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. And I have a few, but I'm going to actually slim it down to one, because I have a feeling we have a talkative group here tonight. So I have one question, and this speaks to my general interest to hear about the lifestyle of authors. And reading your book, I was always fascinated when you wove in the different places. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read one sentence from your book. The chapter Meander, you wrote, "My town is young, barely 100 years old. It has a bubbling, fresh spring American quality I'm reminded of every time I go to Britain or mainland Europe." So if you don't mind, I would love to hear about your location and your lifestyle there.
So I live in Northwest Montana in a town called Whitefish. It's very close to Glacier National Park. It's got a ski town. It's essentially a tourist town. It started out as a railway town, but it's essentially a tourist town. We have lots of hiking, access to wilderness. I didn't grow up here. I went to high school here. I grew up in a town south of Bozeman, Montana called Belgrade, So I lived there until I was 10, and then we moved around quite a bit. And then we landed here when I was in high school. And that's where I graduated high school and moved back to. And one thing that interests me about Whitefish is that when I left, when I graduated high school and went to college, I was away for 20 years. And the integrated walkability infrastructure of this town came into being while I was gone. So it wasn't, I mean, I wouldn't say it was an unwalkable town before, but it has this really big and still growing bike and pedestrian network that like weaves along the river and connects different parts of town, like City Beach, and going out to some of the trails that run through state trust land, which is, open forest mostly. And it's just, what is it? It used to be just under 7,000 people, but it's grown quite a lot recently. But it's still under 8,000 people. So it still feels very small. Like I always used to love writing in coffee shops. I've done that a lot in my life. And I came back home and I started doing that. And then within a short amount of time, I can't really anymore unless I'm willing to be talked to. Several times, because it's got a small downtown core and you see lots of people. My kids walk to school. All of the schools are in town, so they haven't been pushed out to the hinterlands where they have to be driven or take a bus. So that was really important to me when we moved back. I'm grateful that my husband agreed to do that because he's from England, and luckily he likes the lifestyle here. But it was really, really important to me that we lived in town and that my kids would eventually learn a certain level of independence by being able to navigate town by themselves. And I've seen the difference over and over and over with their friends, especially when they were a bit younger. I'd offer to bring them home from school for a play date. And for them, their friends who didn't do this a lot, it was a really long walk. It was a mile. And they didn't know where they were. The walk was hard, whereas my kids were used to it and they know where things are geographically in their heads. And I think that's actually really, really important as children grow as well. And I'm sure that's not new to this group, that navigational skill and ability. Gosh, I don't know. The outdoor lifestyle here is a really strong thing. You've got a lot of people who do backcountry skiing. Hiking's big, mountain climbing, and of course motorsports too, like four-wheeling and snowmobiling and ice skating and all those things. I'm naming winter things because it's winter right now, but we do have a lot of lakes, which is really nice. I feel very fortunate about that because the valley I grew up in near Bozeman, it's beautiful and it has a lot of rivers, but it doesn't really have lakes in the same way. So when it's super hot in the summer, it's nice to have a lot of different places to escape to and just dip in the water and hang out under the trees. And it feels pretty idyllic, honestly, even though the winters are dark and cold and gray most of the time. It's I love being here. I don't want to leave.
It sounds absolutely gorgeous. Do you have a general store?
No.
That's the one thing I'm saying. I have these visions now in my head.
That's such a good question. No, it is a good question, actually, because having gone to high school here, having a memory that goes back 30 years, I can remember when there was a drugstore downtown, which I still miss a lot. And the hardware store, which kind of counted as a general store, I think, only moved out of the main downtown, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, because they just wanted more storage space. And I guess that used to be kind of a general store. It's changed a lot in the last few years. Everywhere does. We've had a lot more wealth move in than we used to have, and it's affected what kinds of downtown businesses we have. So there's a lot of flux right now. I wish we had a general store. I mean, I do really believe in that. So like, you should be able to walk through downtown and get, go to the library, post office, get yourself a coffee, buy milk, take your kid to the playground, and buy bandages if you need to. Like, I have this mental list of things you should be able to walk to. That's one of them. And I'm sorry, there's a town plow going down on the road right now, so I don't know if you can hear that. Hey,
I don't,
Jonathan.
I don't hear it. Yeah, here's speaking of authors, and I have to credit Jonathan, who just arrived with I know your friends, and it was via him that I learned about your book. I think sometime last year or earlier this year. He mentioned it as a must read. I asked for his advice on some reading. He mentioned it as a must read. I immediately ordered it. So thank you, Jonathan. We'll be hosting Jonathan next week. So this is exciting. 2 author roundtables in 1 month. And yeah, I was interested in you mentioned the coffee shops. And so that gives me some visions to work with about your authorly lifestyle. And yeah, how your location integrates with your writerly life. So that was really interesting to hear about. I'll ask Darren if he has another question. If not, we can turn it over to Q&A.
I mean, I do, but I think I know we have some folks here who are probably wanting to ask questions, so I definitely want to turn it over.
Okay, if we could, since there are so many people here, let's just go with the hand raising for least chaos. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat, raise your hand. Darren, I'll really welcome you as co-moderator. So
Great. Yeah, Z, I think you're first there.
Thank you all very much for your thoughts and your questions already. I as well could ask many thoughts, but the thing that you read about movement and flexibility of mind, that really struck a chord with me. And I've been pondering how I find personal mobility actually makes us, like cars and even bicycles to some degree, actually makes us sort of well, like everything is an obstacle for us, basically. So it sort of is corrosive for social relations. And I think walking, because you're, by definition, you're sort of, you have to navigate your space and your conflict in a different way. Like, I think it's a more relaxing and I don't know what the right word is. Just it leads to different sorts of social relations. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that matter, about how the way we travel can actually have impact on our social relations as a society. I mean, I think, you know, and this carries over into other aspects of society, but I think I really think the personal mobility has actually had a really profound influence on a lot of things that we don't necessarily appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's since Jonathan is here, you know, that's something that he's actually taught me a lot about through his writing and work and talks, and the way he talks about doing cross-country walks and meeting people and having expectations defied in a way in both directions. But there's also a lot of research on social capital, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which is this idea that the strength of a neighborhood is built by the connections between people, by those relationships. And of course, Jane Jacobs wrote a lot about that. But there was a researcher in Britain whom Cletus Mobila, who I interviewed for the book, who had done research on social capital in different types of neighborhoods, and everything related to walkability increases social capital. Everything that he studied increased social capital. So that's the strength of connections between neighbors. It's the social trust in a community. It's the kind of thing that when a natural disaster strikes, those are the communities that not survive them, but kind of manage to be resilient through them better, because people know who needs help. People know how to help. People trust one another. And that stuff, you know, it's still kind of slippery to get a grasp on, but it's very real. The one factor that he found that decreases social capital was gated communities. And so some of the research on that is when you close a community off from, or close a neighborhood off from a surrounding community, it feels like it might increase the trust and safety within that neighborhood, but it actually decreases it in surrounding areas. I think I'm forgetting the author's names, but there was a book called Fortress America that kind of studied this phenomenon, that it doesn't really increase the safety within the neighborhood, just the perception of it, but it actually decreases it outside of that neighborhood. But just in general, I think all of us have experienced the difference of having a life that's a little bit slower, that takes more time, factoring in if I need to go from dropping my kid off to school to a doctor's appointment, and I know it's a 20-minute walk as opposed to a 3-minute drive, that changes the way that I live my life. At the same time, I lived in this small town. The neighboring town is much larger, and that's where the main hospital is. And a lot of people who live here work at the hospital. So, for example, I'm conscious that they can't walk their kid to school, walk back home, and get to work on time. And so that's where you have to factor in things like public transit, which we do not have where I live. There's not an option for that. So I find that people are more rushed, more stressed. My town has grown a lot recently, and there's a lot more honking. There's a lot more blowing through crosswalks, more impatience, and people are more impatient with one another, which I think we've also all experienced when people feel rushed and pressured and stressed. But I think the benefits of walking are real. The one caveat is, I was thinking about this when I for an interview I did last year. I think about pre-car societies. Before 1900s in North America or Europe, for example, and they weren't conflict free, right? I look at most of European history, for example, and there's just bloody war after bloody war, and those communities were very walkable. So, it's not a cure-all answer, but I do think that a car-centric culture has made a lot of that stuff worse.
Thank you.
Lorenzo has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Antonia, I haven't had the pleasure to read your book, but I'm looking forward to at least diving into the 7 pages on that you devote to jaywalking and unpacking that. It's kind of what my question is about, is really, what responsibility do automobile organizations such as the OEMs, the large automakers, as well as the Canadian Automobile Association or the American Automobile Association, what's their responsibility in all of this? Because I think that they would acknowledge and agree with many things that you lay out in your book and that other researchers have as well. So just curious, what do you see as their responsibility? And then a second part of that is, any guidance on how we can maybe get them, prompt them to step up to the plate. Any suggestions in that regard would be really appreciated. And also, I have to sort of dash off the call real quick here. I have another appointment. It's midday where I am. So thank you. And I'll listen now.
Thank you. I'll try to be prompt. As far as the answers and solutions go, I really wish that I had some. I've been following America Walks's effort to try to get the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration to change, the way that roads are designed. Just fundamentally, that has to change. There's really no way around that. The priorities need to change. The way things are designed need to change. It's just not going to be safe unless the roads that we're having to share are safe. And as far as the manufacturers, I think they have a huge responsibility. Something I'm sure lots of people have noticed, and I certainly have walking all over my town, is how big cars are now. You've seen that design, and not people who aren't in this world might not notice it so much, but those trucks that I walk by and the hood kind of starts here, and I'm not a super short person, but and they've got that straight hood line, so they can't see children in front of them. And I honestly, I feel super strongly about it. I don't know why that stuff is allowed. I just don't think it should be allowed for manufacturers to put these vehicles, offer these vehicles to be driven on roads when they're being shared with people who are, not just walkers, but people in smaller cars, a little sedan or my old Subaru. I think they have an enormous responsibility to start taking the rest of society and the space that they share into an account when they're designing these vehicles. And I don't see a whole lot of that right now. I hate to say it's got to be like mandated from above, but it doesn't seem to be voluntarily changing except for the worse. I would like to see it voluntarily change, not for the worse, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of that, and I wish I did. But I do think organizations like America Walks have done tremendous work, not just on advocating and lobbying for these kinds of changes, but on educating. Just so many people we just live in our world and we're living our lives, and most people don't see the way that things are structured and the way things are designed that make it all less safe and less pleasant and degrade the quality of the communities. And America Walks, I think, has done a lot of work on trying to help people understand that the world doesn't have to look like this. And it could be better for everybody.
In that
Thank
vein,
you.
Thank you.
in that vein, Nia, I just learned an expression today from the podcast, The War on Cars. It's called the Copenhagen Syndrome. When we come back to the States after we've been in certain cities in Europe and elsewhere, the grief that we feel at having to navigate through all the F-150s on our sidewalks and streets once we get home.
Oh, that's sad. I mean, sad that it's a syndrome, but it's true. Also, just to throw in, Jonathan has a great episode on the War on Cars that came out pretty recently. That was fantastic. I highly recommend it to everybody.
I was hoping that was the same Jonathan.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you too. Yeah, I mean, I lived in Europe for a while, and my husband's from Nottingham in England, and his parents never owned a car. They never learned to drive. I had to teach him to drive when he was 30 because we were moving from Boston to upstate New York, and we were moving to a place where we were going to be dependent on having two cars, not just one car. We have one car right now. We did buy a 79 Chevy truck a couple of years ago because it just we go camping a lot and stuff, and we kind of needed something to haul things around, but I get stuck on it all the time because I don't want to have to depend on a car for anything really, but it'd be a hard ask to be able to go camping with a bunch of kids without a car.
I've noticed a phenomenon lately. My wife has never had a driver's license. She grew up in New England, always had public transport, and we live in a university town. We're very car dependent most of the time, but we live within walking distance to the library, to the grocery store, to work, and that sort of thing. And the phenomenon I've noticed is that even with inveterate drivers, when they hear that Vanessa has reached this stage of life, never driven a car, there's often a very wistful look, almost of incipient envy in a way. And I think we may be reaching a critical mass amongst some folks of realizing that sometimes your happiness in a city is inversely proportional to how often you need to use a vehicle.
I would agree with that. If I have to drive my car more than 2 or 3 days a week, maybe I do get kind of grumpy, because most days I don't have to. But again, I work from my home, so I don't have to commute anywhere. Interesting. My stepmom, who's also Russian, like my dad, they live 15 miles away, and she's never driven. She doesn't know how to drive. And unfortunately, we don't have any public transportation. So when they come to visit the grandkids, one of us has to go pick her up. If my dad happens to be away, then one of us has to go pick her up. And it can be limiting, but it's also interesting to see her friends in that town who find the idea of not getting everywhere by car strange. It's interesting to see how they relate to her and her mobility. And it's funny for them. It's a way to connect with her too, giving her rides, like to go to the big box stores or the grocery store, or other things. And actually, everybody, if you're interested, you should follow Greg on Instagram, because I haven't been on Instagram in a couple of years, but one of the ways we originally connected was photos of your daily walks to work, which was really lovely.
Yeah, once the pandemic started, I started walking every day to work and posting about it, because frankly, it's also my antidepressant and anti-anxiety drug to be able to do that.
What
Yeah.
is Greg's Instagram? Do you guys mind putting it in the chat?
I'll put it in the
I've
chat.
forgotten. I got rid of all my social media about almost been 2.5 years now, so I kind of blanking. The one I keep track of is Jonathan's, because he does the pedestrian dignity, so I'm always having to point people that way. And there's some interesting stuff going on in the chat too about, like, in Iran, the size of cars are more normal, which I think is true in a lot of non-North American countries, and in Europe it's heavily regulated. And Zvi brought up Peter Norton of Fighting Traffic, whom I interviewed him at length for my book and have talked with him since then. He's such a resource for all of this history. I don't know if you've had him on the network, but Peter Norton is like, everything circles back to his research and his work. I think he's a professor in the history of technology. And he really understands how to talk about how the car manufacturers and the car world took over the streets and took over the roads. And he's just really smart and generous and good at talking about these things. And it really, that book opened my eyes a lot, just seeing all the newspaper reports from the early 1900s of how much people hated cars and how they didn't want them on the streets. They wanted their streets for living and for people.
I know
And-
for me, especially when I'm on a, talking like this, and the challenges that cars have created in our society, people often ask me, if you look behind me, I'm a car guy. I love the automobile as a design feature. I love driving long distances, but in my daily routines, I much prefer to walk or ride my bicycle, wherever I go. But I know people often ask me about the conflicting life that I lead, or the messages, which is why I had to create 2 Instagram accounts, because one of them, when I go to car shows, there's always about cars. I don't want people to get the wrong idea.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, really quick. Well, there's a sentence in your book that just relates to all of this. On page 227, you write, but driving for pleasure, for a treat, is very different from living a car-dependent life. And we have several Americans here in this meeting, and I'm so fascinated by the whole thing of the car packaged up as freedom and everything. And as Darren has just referenced, I was just in a car this morning with my husband in Warsaw traffic, which I don't know if any of you have been to Warsaw. We're planning a meetup. We might just want to have an activity of getting in a car and experiencing Warsaw morning traffic. My husband said this morning, we just lost a few years off of our life just from the stress of, we do it sometimes because it's shorter, but I say we're gonna end up divorced or something if we commuted every morning together, because the level of stress is so high. The traffic is, you really have to see it. So I really like that, what you wrote, that it's very different to go on a road trip, and as actually Mike McGinn of America Walks said, I interviewed him and he said it's one thing to go on a road trip, but we shouldn't have to road trip to the grocery store,
True. It's funny, I've been thinking, I don't know why I've been stuck on the grocery store trip recently. And I can and do walk or bike to our big grocery stores quite frequently. But when I need something big, I'll take the car. And I for some reason, I've been stuck on when I used to live in Vienna, and you just didn't do a big grocery shop ever. It was a daily, stop by one of the corner, and they're all chain grocery stores. They're not like cute little mom and pop places, but you just buy your stuff every day, pretty much, except for Sunday because everything was closed. But yeah, it's funny. I actually get asked that question a lot. The one about the pleasure of driving and road trips. And I was born and raised in Montana, and I live here, and I do love that long road trip, especially if it's by myself, which I kind of feel bad about. But over the last even 3 years, even before COVID, I was kind of you know, I'm struggling with flying a lot. I more and more, I'm just like, I'm not sure this is something that any of us should be doing when it's a choice and for pleasure, just for climate and space and all sorts of reasons. And Montana's a huge state, like square kilometers. I think it's slightly larger than Britain, and it's barely got 1 million people. So my part of the state feels crowded to me because there's a lot more here than a lot more people here than there were when I was a teenager. But I mean, just less than half an hour away and even more. And it's really wide open. And we have this highway 2 that runs around over the mountain pass from where I live to the plains and prairie, through the Blackfeet Reservation and just like over the top of Montana. It's Highway 2. We call it the High Line. And I love driving the High Line. It's just, I just really enjoy it. There's a certain type of music I listen to. I went elk hunting over there last year. My family and I, we went to the American Prairie Reserve a few times, which is a beautiful place over in eastern Montana. It's a really interesting endeavor to protect grasslands. And I love it. But I really think that there's a huge difference, like Darren said, between being able to do that sometimes and enjoy it versus everyone being required to have a car for anything they need to do. If our grocery stores were a little further out and there weren't a sidewalk to them, I don't think I could walk to them at all. And that's, you know, the whole freedom thing. It's like, what kind of choices do we have? You know, people talk about choices a lot. I remember when Michael Pollan's books were really big and there was a lot of conversation about food deserts in a lot of neighborhoods. And there's lots of places that are walking deserts, and they tend to be the same places that are food deserts as well. Like, how do you access a life that feels good mentally and physically, you know, and can feed your spirit and anything else? It's our infrastructure makes or breaks that. And there's no way around it. You know, you can't, it's not an individual choice thing. I chose to move to my hometown, but there's a lot of privilege in that. And the way I live has a lot of privilege in it, and it shouldn't be that way. It just, everybody should have that option.
Yeah,
Get right.
Jonathan.
Oh, there's so many things here. The thing that keeps coming up as you're sharing, Antonia, too, is I think, and just affirming with you all, like the gap between car ownership, driving, and joy and roaming and just functional car usage of getting from place to place even. But something that's so loud here in the US, and I'm curious if it is in other places, is we center our education, our getting a license, our systems, like our state departments of transportation, like we center the term transportation as car transportation. And so it's not even our language for how we educate, how we train, how we get licenses, how we think about moving through place. Even for, it's like, it's all centered systemically around car transportation. So we're just, from the beginning, we're so dishonest about the terms we use, because transportation is lumped and linked from the beginning. If you're 14 or 15, transportation is linked. And so if you're outside of that, you're less than, you're constantly struggling to get, I mean, the equity issues are outrageous here. They're outrageous because we systemically, and in the marketing, I could go on and on, but it's just I think even just the term transportation in the US is so dishonest. It's so misguided, and it leaves out millions of people in a public, statewide, citywide, regional wide, national. It literally leaves out and pushes other modes to all the edges. And so it makes car ownership so feel is what you drive. And it's just like, I think just that term transportation in the US is so dishonest from a systems perspective, that it feeds this this capacity to attach all these things to it that are so harmful to those that that can't legally, medically, socially, financially drive a car.
Mhm. And whose communities
And
are
it's
affected by it, right?
yeah.
Yeah, it's I actually wanted to ask Barb if she had any any thoughts about I know you're just watching, but I was thinking about departments of transportation. It's, it's interesting. I do advocacy work in my town, partly because I just believe in it so strongly. I really believe in a walkable life. I believe in how it benefits us individually and how it benefits our communities. And I run into that stuff all the time. And now I live in a town that has spent like 20, 30 years investing in bike and pedestrian trails that are connected to trails out in the, in the woods that were granted through conservation easements. Like, this is a town that is very pro active lifestyle, pro walking and biking. But you get into the weeds of it, and there's a couple of specific situations. Like there's this missing bit of bike and pedestrian trail along the river that's been fought by the people whose condos are right in front of it. It's a really long story, but the town has an easement. They don't want it. Yeah, yada yada. It just goes back and forth. And when I was giving public comment about it and talking to city council, the thing I had to keep bringing up over and over was, okay, we're a tourist town. So a lot of people think that these trails are for the tourists to like take a bike from their hotel and wander around, and it feels good. And it's like slightly European because you can, get places without a car. But I don't know how many people on city council actually use this network as transportation. And that, is exactly what you're saying. I just had to keep bringing it up over and over. And the people who are resisting it do not see it that way. They see it as something that the town is spending their tax dollars on for the benefit of tourists. And so this is that language. I don't want to call it a battle, but it feels like a battle, is one that I am having weekly and have been for, ever since I moved back here 8 years ago, even with people who like want their kids to be able to walk to school safely. That idea that how you get places doesn't just have to be in the car. And then on top of that, we have the State Department of Transportation that, I'm like at city council all the time, like, no, you cannot put another lane on the highway that runs right through the middle of town and expect this community to still survive. Like the part of town I live in, we cross that road to get to the schools every single weekday. And you do that, we will not be able to do that. And there's a lot of families over here. We can't, like, trying to help people understand, decision makers, people who have the power to build this infrastructure, that this choice fundamentally changes people's lives for the worse and degrades the quality of the community. And that's like, my kids can go play with their friends in that part of town by themselves. You add that highway lane, they can no longer do that because it's already a little risky. Everyone's got these bigger cars and they're driving faster and they're on their phones. And then our county is much more conservative than the town I live in. And we keep trying to get a countywide like bike trail system. And that language it's right there. It's immediate. It's, well, gas taxes pay for our roads. You want a bike trail, you need to find, funds to come up with it, because in their minds, bike trail means spandex clad privileged person on a Saturday. It does not mean my stepmother can maybe come visit us without us having to drive there and come back, or maybe my son, who's going to be he'll be 16 next year, like maybe he could ride a bike to the community college in the next town over. I don't know if they will ever be able to think about that kind of thing as transportation. And it's like, you see how deeply that goes into people's minds and how difficult it is to help shift their perspective. And that's, I appreciate, Jonathan, your writing and your work in pedestrian dignity in helping to do that. And it's, for a long time, my whole thing has been like, I want my writing to help shift people's perspectives even a little bit, and just trying to find different ways to do that, different stories, different language, ways to reach people. I always have this thing where I'm like, you got to reach people where they are, or meet people where they are. But sometimes where they are is just, it feels like another planet. And it's like, I don't have a spaceship, I can't get there. I'm not sure how we connect on this issue that affects both of our lives in significant ways. Like, it's not just something we can ignore and drop. So he's saying in the chat, I make a distinction between transportation, mobility, and accessibility, related but not quite the same. Yeah, I think that's kind of true. I like to think of transportation as any way of getting places you need or want to go. I think I said this in the introduction of my book, that, you know, I use the word walk, but I wanted my book to be very disability centric, partly because my mother-in-law is in a wheelchair and my cousin in Russia is in a wheelchair. And so, you know, I've had a lot of experiences of seeing the barriers of trying to get around and accessing basic services like a public bathroom, for example, when you're in that. So I said at the beginning of my book that I think of walking, you know, bipedal walking as an evolutionary term that defines our species, but walking is something I think of as being able to get where you need or you want to go in the way that makes you feel most connected to the world. I don't even remember the words I used, but they're in there somewhere. But that's what I think of as walking. And I think transportation should be that too, you know, that bus systems supplement walking in a way that allows you to get where you need to go, in a way that makes you feel most connected to your world and your community. Those are good distinctions, though. I'll have to think about those words a bit more.
Go ahead, Barb.
Thanks. Barb Chamberlain. I'm in Olympia, Washington. I do work for a state Department of Transportation, used to be called the Department of Highways. So actually moving to say transportation and not just highways was an evolutionary step in the right direction. I'm also in one of the most progressive states for how we talk about transportation, and that we are sincerely multimodal. We haven't done it all yet, but we're in the throes of doing it. And things like saying a highway in the middle of a town is no longer a highway, it's a local street. It needs to function as a local street. You need to be able to cross it. So I love doing this work at this time in this state, not going to move to any other state.
I was making sure, because he's a little.
And I'm originally from Idaho, so I also grew up where you didn't get groceries without getting in a car and going somewhere and doing a massive buy because it was such a long trip. And I'm just wondering, because this is an international audience, I guess a couple of things. One is it the scale of our country? Like, each of these states could be a country any place else. Is that part of what's done this? And also the discussion around, I guess, an emphasis on rights. And I would say that feels sort of very American in a way to me, but that's because I am an American. In our state, one of the things that has really pushed policymakers is the disability rights movement, and pointing to how many people are non-drivers, period. You know, A to Z going to be a non-driver, and how many more people will end up as non-drivers. Like your stepmom, you know, at some point loses transportation independence. And so how do we plan for those things? And I was just wondering about that sort of international feeling of both distance and scale being a factor, and then because we do love our sprawl here, and then whether rights language resonates to talk about the needs of everybody using transportation, or is there some other framing that works effectively other places?
The rights thing. I'm glad that you brought that up in the way that you did, because something I've revolved in my head over and over the past couple of years is the idea of rights versus responsibilities. Which is something I heard Stan Rushworth talk about at some point. Like, Americans just are obsessed with what our rights are, but forget that they go hand in hand with our responsibilities. I think I said this in my War on Cars interview, but I don't think it ended up being in in the final production, just talking about that, like the car feels like the embodiment of that. Like, it is my right to be able to get in whatever size vehicle I feel comfortable in and go where I feel I need to go, like to the front door of whatever it is, in the easiest, most friction-free way possible. But flipping it and talking about disability rights is really interesting. There was some group in Washington State did a study, didn't they? And I can't remember where I came across it. It was like 32% of people don't or can't drive, don't drive for whatever reason. Even if it's, temporary recovering from surgery or a permanent disability. Yeah, I think that's the Disability Rights Washington. And I ended up sending that to our city engineer because, I'm just constantly on them about thinking about all of this stuff differently. And that goes back to the universal design concept, right? If you build your infrastructure for wheelchairs, for example, you benefit everybody. So if you build your infrastructure and your community for, what's the word? Just maybe the most disadvantaged in certain ways, whether it's food access or otherwise, you end up building it for the benefit of everyone. Everybody benefits from that. But I do think rights are important because I think we dismiss those a lot. My stepmother shouldn't have to just rely on other people for cars, car rides when she needs to get places. There should be a bus for her to take around. But that goes back into the responsibilities. And what was the second part of the question? Was no, the first part. What was the first part?
Scale, I guess.
Scale.
Yeah, the scale of.
I think that Peter Norton's work is really important in that respect because he does such a good job of showing how we're sold the story that we wanted cars and that we wanted this car lifestyle where we can, hit the open road. I don't know if anybody here reads Willa Cather. It's a very American author, Craig. I'm not sure if she's got a huge international audience, but she was a novelist from the early 1900s whom I'm actually named after one of her books, My Antonia, which is my mother's favorite when I was born. So I have a particular affection for. But I reread all of her novels last year. And one of the things that kept jumping out at me was there were all these. So she writes about the frontier, basically, or what we think of as the frontier. And there's all these little prairie towns, all these little farm towns, and they are all served by trains. Like, people do not drive to cities. It's just not how they get around. They're going to university, they're going to the East Coast, or wherever they're going, they're getting on a train. And there were trains everywhere. And I've seen some maps of these, of where the old train lines were, and then trams. Like, I saw a map, someone on Twitter had posted it, of tram lines, like not even trains, just intercity tram lines, like going west beyond Chicago even, I think. Is really, really incredible. And I think that we started to lose those things as what Peter Norton calls motordom started to take over the cities first. And then I think a lot of the railways also were financially non-viable in the long run, but I don't know exactly how they were lost. But I think we used to be able to get around this country in ways that didn't require a car. Even these big, these vast Western spaces had train lines going to the tiny little towns. So yeah, I don't know. I think that is the scale has fed into the motordom, car-centric lifestyle that we've been sold, kind of, and that we believe in, or many people believe in now, but I don't think that's where it started. I think it started with cities, probably. People not wanting to use public transportation. Those are great questions, though. It's really good. And thank you for the work you do, Barb. Even if I'm not in Washington, I'm grateful.
Do we have anybody else with other questions? I guess, my next inquiry is, do you have plans to go? Is there another book in the works where you're going to explore this further, or you just kind of do the smaller writings, the shorter format writings, or?
I actually spent a lot of time developing a book proposal for about private property and ownership in the commons a couple of years ago, and I was super into it and worked really hard on it. And I'm afraid every publisher turned it down for various reasons. One of which is that I don't have a Twitter account, it's bizarre. I've been having a lot of conversations with friends about this recently, because I've got a couple of friends with books coming out next year, and one of them in particular, her great Twitter account has come up. It's not the only reason, but platform is certainly part of it. And there's a lot of writing ideas that, you poke into and play around with, and if nobody wants to put them up, then you can drop them. But this particular one, I'm afraid, didn't let me go. And I'm just obsessed with it. But I think, to me, it's deeply integrated with walking and walkability, because, so much of it is about land and access. Like, where can you walk? Yeah, Montana's got quite a lot of public land, which is nice. But there's so much of it that's fenced off and has barbed wire and has signs that say trespassers will be shot. And it's Montana. I take that seriously. But, a state like Texas I believe it's 98% private property. And I was talking with, I don't know if anybody has read the book Windswept by Annabelle Abbs. I know Greg has, because we talked about it. It's a beautifully written book, and she's English, and it's about women walking. So it's like Georgia O'Keeffe and Gwen John, who was a Welsh painter, I think, and lots of different women. Nan Shepherd, who's, I don't know, come a lot of nature circles recently, and she talked about coming to Texas and then the Southwest of the U.S. to visit where Georgia O'Keeffe worked and walked, and just how much it messed with her mind to not be able to roam around, like to really have to think about where the private property was, to watch where there might be a sign or where there might not be a sign, but you'd be trespassing. It really came home to me again, just how much that kind of thing affects your freedom to walk. So because none of the publishers we sent it to were interested, I've been working on a different book proposal, but I ended up, I think, planning to publish it on my Substack newsletter, which just feels really weird and odd. And it's strange to be trying to write something huge without sort of institutional support. I have to keep forcing myself to remember that, I have subscribers and I'm doing this for them. Yes, Andrew Linklater's book, Owning the Earth, was it was actually really fundamental in how I learned to think about this, because he goes into all these different commons-based ownership systems that kind of got taken over by a private property system. I'm on a 3-month contract now for a company called Threadable, which is a new social reading app. And I'm doing a land ownership reading circle there. So you sign up for the app. It's only on iOS, so Apple devices right now, but you sign up for the app and then you can join these different reading circles. There's a bunch of really cool ones. And on mine, I've got a selection from Owning the Earth. I'm doing Nick Esta's Our History is the Future next week. Doing some old documents like the Charter of the Forest from the 1200s in England. So, it feels, I think one of the reasons I didn't do a good enough job selling it to publishers through my book proposal was because the idea is so huge and it's so central to the way modern Western life is shaped and structured. And it's one of those things where you're like, if a fish, you can't see water. And I think if you're, North American specifically, but also European and lots of other countries person, you can't see ownership. Like you can't see how the private property structure shapes everything in our lives, how that paradigm shapes the way we relate to each other and the way we relate to the planet and so many different things. And I really do, I think that walking was what led me to that, because I walked so much when I was researching this book. And I just, you become aware of where you can't. And whether that's because there's too much traffic, because there's a highway in the way, because there's private property signs, or like in London, where there's all these spaces that look like public spaces, but they're actually leased to private companies. And so suddenly your freedom is very different, even though you think you're in a public space, but you're not. And I just think it's very central to life. Oh, Jonathan, yeah, I had La Vega in it was in your book. This place in Colorado, one of the remaining commons in the US. And I think like at the same time I was reading your book, High Country News did a feature on this. Maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about it now or next week when you do your roundtable, but it's a complicated case, right?
Yeah.
These commons, this land was given to people before that, when that part of the country was still Mexico. And then the US said, well, we'll honor that law, that Mexican law. But then over time, I don't know, it's been like the courts are like, well, it's too much trouble to honor that law or something. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I just want, just with all your writing on commons and how just that they're still actively, they still have a committee that, is voting on who gets to use the land. So it's a pretty big piece of land in rural Colorado that is managed by the people, and it's connected to the land rights that the people have in the Sangre de Cristos right outside of these small villages in southern Colorado. And they did win partial rights back from the Supreme Court in 2018, which was a big win, but still fighting for a lot of it. But just related to broad common space, publicly owned, people owned community space. It's a really interesting example of something that's still being sustained, but is on a lot of edges. And so I just love that you're writing about these things, because it's so important and it's so connected. So
yeah, I think, and it's like, so my family homesteaded in Montana. I'm the 5th generation. So we've been here a small amount of time comparatively to people who have been here 10, 30,000 years. And my family still, what is it? My second cousin, I think, still runs the original homestead ranch. And so I'll take my kids over and go visit. And it's just amazing to me, with all that wide open space, like really, really sparsely populated, it does not feel free at all, because everywhere you turn, there is barbed wire fences and no trespassing. And even on their land, which is thousands of acres, you're constantly slipping through these fences, these reminders of these barriers, and what you can and can't access. And there's a big case that wouldn't really be important to people outside of Montana, probably in the crazy mountains, where there's a Forest Service trail that has an easement through private property and has for decades. And the private property owner keeps closing it off. And the Forest Service has refused to pursue that. So there's some conservation groups that are trying to force them to, because it's access to a huge parts of public land and wilderness and elk hunting country. That's probably why it's gotten most attention. But if you lose land access, you lose walking too. I think it was in Rebecca Solnit's book in Wanderlust, she talked about the sidewalks in Las Vegas, and like ostensibly that's public space, but it gets leased to the casinos, and so they can control what happens on that space. It actually really matters what's public and what's private when we're talking about walking or anything else, really. Anyway, that was a really long answer to a very short, what are you working on next question?
Annika, did you have another question? I know you said you had a few of them there.
Well,
have
we
a few
could
minutes left.
soon, yeah, we have a few minutes. And I personally found your reading very nice, and I thought it would definitely be wonderful to round off with that. But something I do like to do, this will take me about a minute. I do like to go down the list of all of who was present. So Antonia, so you know who was here in all the locations. Of course, you, Whitefish, Montana, myself in Warsaw, Poland, Darren in Madison, Wisconsin, Greg, who I learned is in Lexington, Kentucky, Alan, London, England, Barb, who I learned is in Olympia, Washington, correct? Carrie in Portland, Maine, USA, Mohammed in Isfahan, Iran, Lorenzo in Toronto, Canada, Zvi in Montreal, Canada. Antonella was here. I believe she's in Birmingham, England. Mercy is based in the Netherlands, originally from Accra, Ghana. Blair is in New York, USA, and Jonathan in Denver, Colorado. So it's an exciting, interesting spread here this evening, or morning for some, afternoon for others.
I appreciate you did that. Usually when I do something like this, I ask people to tell me where they are because I just am curious. Or if it's a university class, just where they're from. I'm always interested in where people are. Did the person from Birmingham already left?
Yeah, some people have left. For those who didn't ask questions, if you we don't have much time left, but Blair, Carrie, Mohammed, if you want to briefly introduce yourself and your location yourself, if that's okay. Blair, are you there?
It's Carrie in Portland, Maine, with Portland downtown. I'm excited. I bought your book the other day, so I'm looking forward to reading it. I saw Darren recommended it, so looking.
Great, Blair.
Hey, sorry. Yeah. No. Wonderful talk. Wonderful presentation. Yes, I'm Blair Lorenzo, a independent professional urbanist and writer myself. And yeah, it sounds wonderful, and I cannot wait to actually check out your book. And I love the reading that opened it and discussion. Absolutely wonderful. So spot on. I couldn't even, don't even have questions because it is so spot on. So really, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and Mohammed.
And thanks for your great presentation. Really was cheerful, and I loved it so much. And I wonder I could purchase your book and read it.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Iran's a place I always wanted to visit.
Yeah, hopefully, a revolution happens soon. So all of you are welcome to visit my country. Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed.
You're welcome.
Well, we are rounding down to the last 10 minutes here. So please feel free if you have more questions. Is somebody raising their hand?
Jonathan is raising his hand.
I just want to affirm the book. Antonia's book is so good. Yeah, and the thing I love about it so much, and it circles back to what you shared, Antonia, about meeting people where they are. I just feel that the whole way through. And it's like it's like holding the hand of research, and it's holding the hand of like our intrinsic inherent steps, or if we move on a wheelchair, wherever we find our bodies moving through space and time. And your creativity around each chapter and just breaking down this inherent movement in a way that challenges us, but it invites us all the time. So I just some added encouragement to get this book and lean into each of these really detailed chapters that are so important. So anyway, just honoring you and your work and how much research and time you put into this one. Yeah.
Thank you. Which I'd say the same for yours. It's Jonathan's is really a necessary read. I think you lean in much harder to some serious and important issues than I managed to do in mine. You know, just a totally random tidbit, but the structure of mine, the chapters themselves were structured in a certain way, but within the chapters, this is just a little writerly thing, but as I was writing it, every moment, not every moment, but frequently, I was like, okay, at what point is someone going to put this down and go check Facebook? So it's one of the things that actually makes readings hard for me, because it does tend to be short chunks and switching scenes, not in a way, I hope it's not in a way that's jarring, but that was I was still on Facebook at the time I was writing it. So it was very much on my mind. It's like, how do you hold hands with people's attention? Oh, wow, the sun's coming out. I haven't seen the sun in like 4 days. But it's, you know, when you're writing, when you're advocating, when you're doing any kind of work, really, it's like, where are people's heads right now? And that can be something that's really complicated to figure out. I think just thinking about when are people going to go check Facebook is easier than a lot of what I see now where I live, which is, what conspiracy theory is my neighbor coming from? And, you know, that sounds like a joke, but it's where I live. It is not. It's literally my neighbor. And this is, you know, a lot of my neighbors. And it's really difficult, actually, to figure out how to do that. But I don't see how else we live together. We try. Oh, thank you, Greg. It's kind of you. Also, Death Comes for the Archbishop is my favorite book.
It is one of my favorite books of all time. And of course, it takes place in a time in history where walking or riding a donkey was pretty much the only way to get around, though towards the latter part of the book, I think the trains start. But yeah, read it when I was 17, and it's one of those I go back to like every 5 years.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, I highly recommend Willa Cather. I always say that's my favorite book. And then I think the most important book I've ever read was Svetlana Alexievich's The Unwomanly Face of War. I don't know how many people have read that. She won the Nobel Prize for that a few years ago, but it was published in the 1980s. And it's about all these women in the Soviet Union who volunteered and signed up to fight in World War II. It's an oral history, which is part of why I think it's so important, because it's individual people's stories of what's actually happening during wartime. And I think it also, I don't know if it intentionally does this or not, but I think it says a tremendous amount about identity and patriotism and how strongly those things play into the kinds of choices people make. And it's just really great writing too. So much sun.
So exciting. You haven't seen the sun in I haven't seen the sun in like a month, I think. And we got some sun today, so I see it beaming on you. That's great.
Yeah, we live in an inversion layer place. So when it comes out in the winter, it's like, whoa. It's always surprising. Maybe not as much as Seattle, but it's pretty gray. This is amazing, you guys. I'm excited to see more of the kind of work everybody's doing wherever you are, where you're living. It's just, I don't know, it's universal. Building a walkable world for our communities and one another.
I just have to share, you know, just my own personal experience with the network. I had connected up with Annika earlier this year, I think January, February. And then we launched our different work groups, and I have the pleasure of being involved with two of them actively. And like this morning, Muhammad and I were on in a work group call, and we have folks from Stockholm, and sometimes we have folks from Addis Ababa and other places around the world. And it has just been really eye-opening to me to see what I observe here in and fortunately it's universal. As some of the challenges, it's packaged a little bit differently, but the challenges are universal. So it gives me hope that collectively we can continue to work on solutions to these.
Yeah. And it's huge. I was on a panel a few years ago with a friend of mine she's a reporter for The Guardian, and she talked about being in Rwanda for a story one time. And this wasn't part of the story, but it's just something she noticed and researched a bit about when she was there. There were 2 development companies that were developing highways for this Rwandan city she was in. And one was Chinese and one was German. And the German company built this beautiful 2-lane highway, paved, just, like an Autobahn, like great for cars. But the Chinese company built a pretty decent 2-lane highway, but with lots of walking access. And she just talked about it really well, because she talked about it's such a lesson in you coming into a place. Are you meeting the needs of the people who are actually there? And the people in that city walked to get places. They mostly didn't drive. And so the Chinese company looked at how they actually lived and tried to meet that need. And the German company was just like, you need a highway. Here's a good highway. It was really interesting to hear that perspective.
Okay, we're coming up to the end here. I want to point out what is my favorite sentence in your entire book. If I had a physical space for the network, like a community center, I would have this quoted on the wall among authors' quotes, and then perhaps we can close out with you reading, which I think would be a really nice touch. Thank you. But my favorite line in the book is in the chapter Invitation, and it's towards the end of the chapter, and you write, "We start by falling in love with walking again." And to me, this is just everything. I'm actually getting emotional reading it right now, because I think bringing in the emotion is I think something that I think almost everybody gathered here, we're all part of this mobility paradigm shift in some way, but I do feel it's a bit unique to reference the emotional piece. And as Jonathan, I know, Jonathan, don't put the Jonathan knows I sent him pictures of me crying while reading his book. So connecting with the heart, I think, is just it's just as important as providing more tram lines, connecting with this heart piece, and connecting with the love of walking, and the love of I loved how you mentioned your lifestyle in Vienna too, how even your little routines for grocery shopping. I'm obsessed with my like Saturday errands in the city by foot, and we stopped going to the big box grocery store. For me, this has revolutionized my daily life, and it's makes me fall in love with my daily habits. So we start by falling in love with walking again. I just love that.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. It's interesting. I interviewed, I did a little group interview. There was an anthology that came out. I don't have it. I can't remember where I put it. It's called Ways of Walking, and it's edited by Anne DeForest. It's a collection of essays, and I interviewed, Jonathan knows about it. I got in touch with the editor, and I was like, you need to read this person's book. We're just each other's PR team, maybe at this point. Anyway, I interviewed a few of them who had done this, it was like an artist residency, and what they decided to do was walk the perimeter of Philadelphia. And it's turned into this thing that they do every year, and they got so much at it. And towards the end of thank you, Zvi. It's nice to meet you. Towards the end of the conversation, they were just talking about the embodiment aspect of walking a lot, and all of a sudden realizing that you're a body walking, and what that feels like mentally and spiritually and physically. And I then ended up keeping them on another 10 minutes, because I was like, this is the thing that got me at the end of my book. And it came out of that. It was like, there's a totally different avenue to the world that we want to see, and the world that we would like to build for one another. And maybe it's through falling in love with walking, which can help us find a different relationship with our own bodies and the way that we are in the world. And then that has a different relationship to the world around us and our interconnection with everything. And so we ended up talking about embodiment a lot and what it means to be a body moving through the world, or a mind body, I guess is how I put it. And it's just, I don't know, now everyone I talk with, Jonathan was the one who told me about seeing walking as like a nautilus shell that everything about our humanity spins out of. And it's like everybody who does this up to a certain point finds their way to that same feeling, like, oh, being an alive human in this world is totally different from what I've always been told it is and what I always thought it was. Which is really, I don't need to read, because actually that's almost the last line of the second passage I was gonna read.
Okay.
It's just, I had a little passage about Jane Jacobs's book, Dark Age Ahead, because she ended up pretty pessimistic at the end of her life, and saw communities decaying because of cars and highways and suburbs. And that's from the chapter that's about how communities are building walkability, which is how I ended up in Denver, with Jonathan and Pam Giner and those amazing people. And, you know, just trying to give a little, like, I'm not going to shove hope into you, but here's some of the work that's being done and what it looks like, and the people doing it. And just the last line of that little section is, how we build walking into or out of our lives says everything about the kind of humans we imagine we will become. Just feel like that feeds into falling in love with walking and the world.
Absolutely. So thank you. This was really special. And I feel like it's also connecting to so many ideas for future roundtables. And before we started recording, I made sure to welcome you to the network, because I thought, of course, we have to have you. And yeah, I look forward to sharing this. And this was really special. We're looking forward to, I just love that Jonathan's here too. This is all connected. It's all connected. So looking forward to Jonathan's roundtable next week. And right, you'll be able to continue connecting with everybody that was here. And I'm happy to meet also the connections you brought in. And just thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for setting this up and for all your reading and thoughts and everything, and for all the work. Mohammed's the last one here from the network, and Barb too, all the work that you guys do on this. I don't think it would be possible without people really doing the groundwork.